The torches flicker inside the imperial hall, casting long, trembling shadows across marble walls that have witnessed centuries of conquest. You can smell the wine before you see it. Thick, sweet, heavy in the air. Laughter echoes, then dies abruptly. A woman is led forward, her sandals scraping softly against the stone floor. She does not scream. Not yet. Her eyes are fixed on the man reclining above her, draped in purple, watching as if the world itself were his stage. Caligula does not rush. He studies her the way a priest studies a sacrifice. Around them, senators avert their gaze. Husbands clench their fists in silence. No one moves. No one dares. In that moment, you realize something terrifying. This is not desire. This is not passion. This is power pressing itself into human flesh. If an emperor believes he is a god, what does refusal even mean? And if no one stops him, who becomes the next offering? To understand how this night was possible, you must step back into Rome itself. Not the Rome of postcards and triumphal arches, but the Rome of hierarchy, fear, and carefully performed obedience. In the early 1st century, the Roman Empire was vast, disciplined, and deeply unequal. Law existed, tradition existed, morality existed, but all of it bent toward one truth. The emperor stood above them all. Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, remembered by history as Caligula, rose to power in the year 37 CE. He was only 24. To the public, he was a miracle, the beloved son of Germanicus, the young prince who survived purges, betrayals, and palace terror. The Senate praised him. The people adored him. Coins bore his image as a symbol of renewal. But Rome had a dangerous flaw. Its system depended not on limits, but on restraint. There were no real safeguards against an emperor who refused to restrain himself. In Roman society, women, especially women of the elite, were not private individuals. Their bodies represented alliances, bloodlines, and honor. A senator's wife was not merely a spouse. She was a political extension of her husband. To touch her was to challenge his status. To humiliate her was to humiliate his entire lineage. Caligula understood this perfectly. Ancient historians like Suetonius and Cassius Dio would later struggle to describe his reign without resorting to disbelief. They wrote of madness, excess, and cruelty. But beneath their moral outrage lies something colder. Caligula did not simply break taboos. He targeted them. He chose the most sacred boundaries of Roman life and crossed them publicly, deliberately, repeatedly. Why? Because Rome had taught him a fatal lesson. If power came from fear and spectacle, then domination had to be visible, absolute, unmistakable. When the emperor entered a room, no one could leave. When he desired, no one could refuse. Not because the law said so, but because silence had become survival. And that silence would soon turn the imperial palace into something far darker than a seat of government. Do you want me to continue with Chapter 1? Power over noble flesh. When desire became a political weapon, you are taught that Rome valued discipline, that its elites were bound by honor, law, and ancestral virtue. But under Caligula, those ideals were not destroyed in secret. They were dismantled in public, slowly, ritualistically, and with witnesses. The imperial banquets became the stage. These were not ordinary feasts. They were carefully choreographed performances of dominance. Senators were summoned with their wives, dressed in their finest garments, believing, hoping, that this was still the Rome they understood. Music played, wine flowed, laughter was encouraged, and then, without warning, the rules changed. Caligula would walk among the guests, his eyes lingering not on political rivals, but on their wives. He would ask questions that sounded polite but carried an edge. He would comment on beauty, on posture, on youth. And then, in front of everyone, he would choose. The woman was led away, not dragged, not screaming. That would have been easier. Instead, she was escorted calmly, as if this were an honor. Her husband remained seated. If he protested, he risked more than disgrace. He risked death. If he followed, he humiliated himself further. So he stayed, silent, watching his world collapse one heartbeat at a time. This was not lust, it was theater. By taking the wives of senators, Caligula sent a message sharper than any execution. He was not punishing disloyalty. He was proving that loyalty did not matter. Bloodlines, marriages, reputations, everything that once defined Roman aristocracy existed only by his permission. You can imagine the silence after those banquets, the walk home through torchlit streets, the questions that could never be asked, the children who would later wonder why their parents never spoke of certain nights. Ancient sources describe Caligula returning the women to their husbands afterward, sometimes boasting about their performance, sometimes mocking them openly. This detail is crucial. The cruelty was not in the act alone, but in what followed. The humiliation was designed to linger, to poison relationships, to remind every man in the Senate that his household was no longer his own. Why did no one resist? Because Rome had already taught them obedience. Senators had survived purges under Tiberius by learning when to look away. Caligula merely exploited that survival instinct. He understood that fear works best when it feels normalized, when it wears the mask of ceremony. For the women, the violence was deeper than physical violation. Their bodies were turned into symbols, weapons, proof that even the most private spaces of Roman life were now imperial property. There was no court to appeal to, no law to invoke. The emperor was present, the emperor was watching, and perhaps most terrifying of all, the crowds kept coming back. The banquets continued. The invitations were accepted. Because in Caligula's Rome, absence itself was suspicious. You might ask yourself now, if you had been there, seated among the elite, watching this unfold, would you have stood up? Or would you have stayed seated, telling yourself that silence was wisdom, that survival was virtue? Rome chose silence, and Caligula learned something vital from it. Do you want me to continue with Chapter 2? Ritualized degradation. When sexual violence became a sacred performance, what began as humiliation soon evolved into ritual. Caligula was not satisfied with private domination. He wanted witnesses. He wanted repetition. He wanted the act itself to feel inevitable, as if it were part of Rome's natural order. The palace banquets transformed into something darker than political gatherings. They became ceremonies where power was rehearsed, confirmed, and sanctified. You must imagine the setting carefully. Oil lamps lining the walls, incense burning to mask the smell of bodies and wine, musicians playing softly, never stopping, even when laughter turned to unease. The guests learned quickly that discomfort was expected. Silence was rewarded. Caligula reclined above them, like a judge. Sometimes he participated, often he did not. That distinction mattered. When he watched instead of acted, the message was unmistakable. This was not indulgence. This was authority, observing its own reflection. Women were summoned not as individuals, but as offerings. Their names mattered less than their status. A senator's wife, a general's daughter, a noble widow. Each carried symbolic weight. Their presence signaled which families were being reminded of their place. The act itself, described by ancient historians with deliberate restraint, was never framed as intimacy. It was exposure, the removal of dignity, the transformation of the human body into spectacle. The surrounding men were forced to see, to remember, to internalize the lesson. In Roman religion, ritual created reality. Repetition gave meaning. Caligula understood this instinctively. By repeating sexual violence in formal settings, he stripped it of chaos and turned it into structure. Something expected. Something unremarkable. You may wonder why these scenes were tolerated, why no riot broke out, why no dagger was drawn across the banquet table. The answer lies in fear, but also in conditioning. Rome had long equated authority with performance. Triumphs paraded defeated enemies through the streets. Gladiators died for public amusement. Justice was delivered in amphitheaters. Caligula merely redirected the gaze inward. Instead of foreign captives, Roman elites became the spectacle. The women endured more than physical violation. They endured the knowledge that their suffering was being used to educate others, that their pain was instructional, that it would be remembered long after the bruises faded. Some sources suggest Caligula would later discuss these encounters openly, dissecting them like a critic reviewing art. He spoke of bodies as objects, of reactions as measurements. Pleasure was irrelevant. What mattered was submission, and submission became contagious. As months passed, resistance did not vanish. It adapted. Men learned to anticipate selection. Women learned to lower their eyes. Families learned which invitations could not be refused. Terror, once shocking, became routine. This is how brutality survives, not through constant escalation, but through normalization. Ask yourself something unsettling. At what point does violence stop feeling like violence and start feeling like tradition? When does horror become custom simply because it is repeated often enough? Caligula had discovered the most dangerous truth of all. A population does not need to approve of cruelty. It only needs to accept it as unavoidable. And once that threshold is crossed, the emperor no longer needs to command obedience. The ritual itself enforces it. Do you want me to continue with Chapter 3, Incest, Divinity, and the Collapse of Natural Order? At some point, humiliation was no longer enough. Control over others' bodies no longer satisfied the performance Caligula was building. To go further, he needed to do something more radical than violation. He needed to erase the idea that limits existed at all. This is where the rumors begin. Ancient historians speak carefully, yet insistently, of Caligula's relationship with his sisters, especially Drusilla. They describe a closeness that alarmed Rome, gestures that defied custom, and honors that crossed the boundary between family and divinity. Whether every detail is true matters less than one crucial fact. Rome believed it could be true. In Roman society, incest was not merely immoral. It was an offense against nature itself. It shattered the symbolic structure that held family, inheritance, and social order together. For such rumors to circulate openly about an emperor without immediate denial reveals something profound. The public no longer expected restraint from him. Drusilla was elevated above all others. She appeared beside him in ceremonies. After her death, Caligula declared her a goddess. Temples were built. Oaths were sworn in her name. Mourning became mandatory. The line between sister, consort, and divine figure blurred until it vanished. Why would Caligula allow or even encourage such rumors? Because incest was not the point. Transgression was. By placing himself beyond the most universal taboo, Caligula sent a message more powerful than any decree. He was not merely emperor. He was not merely law. He existed outside the natural order itself. What applied to others did not apply to him. You can see how carefully this was staged. The suggestion alone destabilized Rome's moral universe. If the emperor could violate the most fundamental boundary and remain untouched, then no boundary was real. Every tradition, every protection, every inherited rule depended entirely on his mood. For the elite, this realization was paralyzing. How do you oppose someone who no longer pretends to share your values? How do you appeal to law when the ruler has placed himself above it, not just politically, but cosmically? The fear deepened because no confirmation was ever required. The uncertainty itself became the weapon. Every whisper reinforced the idea that Caligula had become something other than human. In religious terms, Rome had precedent for this transformation. Emperors were honored, deified after death, revered as semi-divine figures. But Caligula collapsed the timeline. He did not wait. He demanded worship now. He dressed as gods. He spoke as gods. He behaved as if morality were an inconvenience designed for mortals. Sexual boundaries, familial boundaries, spiritual boundaries, all dissolved into a single principle: proximity to the emperor-determined reality. Ask yourself what this does to a society. When the ruler claims divinity, disobedience becomes sacrilege. Resistance becomes heresy. Even private thought feels dangerous. For women in Caligula's orbit, this collapse was catastrophic. Their bodies were no longer governed by custom or kinship. They existed within a myth the emperor was actively writing, one where he alone decided what was sacred and what was permitted. Whether the rumors were true or exaggerated no longer mattered. Rome had accepted the possibility, and in doing so, it accepted something far worse. That power, once untethered from human limits, no longer needs justification. It only needs belief. Do you want me to continue with Chapter 4, Sex as Law, when silence completed the system? By the final year of Caligula's reign, something crucial had changed. The acts themselves no longer shocked. What horrified Rome now was how little reaction they provoked. Sexual domination had stopped being an event. It had become infrastructure. No new decrees were needed. No public announcements. Everyone already understood the rules. Invitations arrived without explanation. Women were prepared without being asked. Men adjusted their behavior without being ordered. Fear had done its work so thoroughly that command was no longer necessary. This is how power becomes invisible. Caligula rarely had to enforce his will directly. The court enforced it for him. Servants learned whom to escort. Officials learned whom to ignore. Families learned which questions could not be spoken aloud. Each act of compliance tightened the system further, until resistance felt not only dangerous, but pointless. Silence was the final ingredient. Ancient sources mention fewer protests not because the violence stopped, but because the language to describe it disappeared. When no one dares to record outrage, history begins to sound calm, orderly, acceptable. The absence of testimony becomes mistaken for consent. For women inside the imperial orbit, this silence was devastating. Their suffering did not produce scandal. It produced routine. They were not victims in the public sense. They were logistics, arrangements made quietly, efficiently, without witnesses who might remember too much. This is what distinguishes Caligula's system from mere cruelty. Cruelty still needs force. His rule no longer did. The Senate continued to meet. Laws were debated, coins were minted, Rome functioned. And within that functioning state, sexual violence had been absorbed into governance, treated as an extension of imperial privilege. Ask yourself what kind of terror achieves that result. Not the terror of chaos, but the terror of predictability. When people know exactly what will happen if they resist, most choose not to try. This is why Caligula's reign ended not with a moral awakening, but with a conspiracy. Those closest to him understood something the wider public did not yet grasp. As long as he lived, no private boundary could ever be restored. No family could ever be safe. No silence could ever be permanent. When the knives finally struck in January of 40 CE, they were not only ending a life, they were attempting to end a system that had learned how to operate without commands. But systems, once normalized, rarely die with their creator. Caligula was assassinated. The fear he cultivated lingered. because Rome had learned a dangerous lesson, that a society can continue to function while quietly consuming its own people as long as everyone agrees not to speak, and that lesson would not be forgotten easily. Do you want me to continue with the next section? Comparison and consequences. What Caligula reveals about power across civilizations. It is tempting to isolate Caligula, to label him an anomaly, a mad emperor, a historical accident best confined to footnotes and sensational anecdotes. But that temptation is itself a form of comfort, because once you look beyond Rome, the pattern reappears again and again, under different names, in different costumes, across different centuries. The Roman elite liked to imagine themselves civilized. They contrasted their marble cities with what they called barbarism. Yet what unfolded under Caligula mirrors systems seen far beyond Italy. In the Ottoman Empire, women of the palace were sealed behind walls, their bodies turned into instruments of alliance and succession. In ancient Persia, royal bloodlines were protected through controlled marriages that erased personal choice. In Egyptian temples, young girls were taken, renamed, and ritually stripped of identity under the language of holiness. Different cultures, same mechanism. Power reaches for the body when it can no longer tolerate autonomy. What makes Caligula revealing is not merely what he did, but how openly it was allowed to happen. Rome did not collapse during his reign. Trade continued, armies marched, courts functioned. The system absorbed the abuse and carried on. That is the most disturbing consequence of all. When violence is directed selectively at women, at families, at those whose voices can be suppressed, it does not immediately destabilize a state. It corrodes it quietly. Trust dissolves. Relationships fracture. Fear replaces loyalty. And over time, the very people meant to uphold the system begin plotting its destruction. Caligula's assassination was not a moral reckoning, it was a practical one. The conspirators did not rise up to defend virtue. They acted because the emperor had become unpredictable, even to those who benefited from his power. When no boundary remains, even allies are expendable. The same logic that justified abusing others eventually circles inward. This pattern appears repeatedly in history. Rulers who weaponize intimacy eventually lose the ability to distinguish loyalty from submission. And submission, unlike loyalty, collapses the moment fear shifts. For the women caught in these systems, the consequences are harder to trace. Their names vanish. Their experiences survive only as fragments, filtered through hostile or indifferent sources. History records what power did, not what it felt like to endure it. But silence leaves traces of its own. Sudden changes in law, abrupt shifts in succession, murmurs of scandal without resolution. You may notice how often these stories end without justice. Caligula dies, but his victims receive no restoration. Rome moves on, eager to forget. This, too, is part of the system. Memory is dangerous. Forgetting is convenient. Compare this with modern narratives. We like to believe that visibility equals progress. That exposure prevents repetition. Yet history suggests something less comforting. Power does not require secrecy to abuse. It only requires apathy, or distraction, or the belief that someone else will intervene. So ask yourself, when societies celebrate their achievements, whose suffering is being omitted? When leaders are excused as exceptions, what behaviors are being normalized beneath the surface? Caligula did not invent sexual domination as a political tool. He revealed how easily it can be integrated into governance when institutions lack courage and communities lack voice. That is his true legacy, not madness, not excess, but demonstration. A demonstration of how fragile dignity becomes when power is no longer accountable. Do you want me to continue with the next section? Lessons, warnings, and the future of forgotten atrocities? When history presents figures like Caligula, there is a quiet temptation to treat them as relics, monsters locked safely in the past, proof that humanity has moved on. But the real lesson of his reign is not how extreme he was. It is how ordinary the conditions were that allowed him to exist. Nothing about Caligula's rise required secrecy. He did not seize power through a coup. He inherited a system already trained to obey. The Senate had learned survival under Tiberius by lowering its gaze. The people had learned spectacle through generations of public violence. The army had learned loyalty not to law, but to the man at the center. Caligula merely removed the mask. The most dangerous element in his story is not cruelty, but permission. Once institutions communicate, through silence, compliance, or fear, that certain abuses are untouchable, those abuses spread. They shift, they evolve, and they find new justifications. In Caligula's Rome, sexual domination functioned because it was framed as privilege. In other cultures, similar acts were framed as tradition, religion, or necessity. The language changes. The outcome does not. You may recognize echoes of this today. Systems that control bodies in the name of morality. Leaders shielded by ideology rather than accountability. Victims forced to calculate whether speaking will cost them more than remaining silent. These are not ancient problems. They are recurring ones. History does not repeat itself because people forget facts. It repeats because people underestimate structures. Caligula's assassination did not dismantle the logic he exploited. Rome continued to centralize power. Emperors continued to test boundaries. The lesson learned by successors was not, never do this, but do it more carefully. Hide it better. Justify it more elegantly. This is why remembering these stories matters, not as spectacle, not as scandal, but as diagnosis. When power treats the human body as territory, violence follows. When societies reward silence, suffering multiplies. And when history reduces victims to rumors, the system remains intact. You may wonder what responsibility belongs to the viewer. After all, you did not live in Rome. You did not attend those banquets. You did not look away while someone else was led from the room. But history does not ask for guilt. It asks for awareness. The future of forgotten atrocities depends on whether people recognize patterns before they harden into tradition, whether they question systems before they demand sacrifice, whether they remember that dignity is not preserved by marble statues or noble language, but by refusal, spoken early, spoken collectively. Caligula believed himself untouchable because no one challenged the rules he was rewriting. Every society eventually faces that moment, the moment when obedience feels safer than resistance. What defines it is not what the ruler does, but what everyone else allows. Do you want me to continue with the final section, conclusion, and call to action? Caligula's story is often told as a tale of madness, excess, and depravity. But stripped of spectacle, it reveals something far more unsettling. His reign shows how quickly a society can adapt to cruelty when power demands silence, how easily human bodies become instruments once fear replaces accountability, and how history, when it grows uncomfortable, learns to look away. These acts were not accidents. They were not rumors born of imagination. They were warnings written into the lives of people whose names rarely survived the empire that consumed them. Remembering them is not about condemning the past. It is about recognizing the patterns that still shape the present. If this story unsettled you, that discomfort has value. Share it. Speak about it. Question what is presented as tradition or authority. And if you want to continue exploring the histories that power tried to bury, subscribe to Forbidden Chronicles. The stories we forget are often the ones we most need to confront.